So I'm Richard Miles, co-founder of the Cade Museum, and so thank you, Nigel, for that talk. And you offered two critiques of the educational system with regard to sort of this denial, right, of what's coming in terms of potential that up to half of jobs or more will disappear. And you say pretty much in terms of the menu of educational options that everything from primary to secondary to tertiary education systems are offering, it's pretty much more the same. And then you said there's a second response in which, well, let's just make everyone go into STEM education, because that will surely save us. But you say, no, teaching everyone to code is not the answer, which you mentioned tonight. And then what warmed my heart is you said, well, the solution is, I'll quote from you here, you recommend a capacity for self-invention and reinvention, which includes a healthy mix of the liberal arts and the humanities so that we can, quote, mediate between technology and its users, and that human creativity and empathy will be central to careers in a work environment dominated by machine learning. So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is find out what it means to be truly human on the assumption that machines can't copy that, whatever it is, and then learn that. And that reminds me of the Groucho Marx joke, authenticity is the most important character trait, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. So. But then you go on to say, well, this is really what policymakers should be doing, steering not just educational institutions, but labor unions and so on. And so my question, isn't that sort of philosophical quest exactly the sort of thing that policymakers are terrible at, and educators for that matter, at a philosophical level, defining what is human and trying to learn it. So how does one come up with an actual policy, laws, regulations, curriculum guidelines to make students of today and tomorrow more competitive if even part of your prediction is in fact going to come true?
A couple of comments. I mean, one is that I do think STEM is a delusion. I think it's a sort of drinking the Kool-Aid. Basically, every public authority in the world that is interested in any way in addressing the issue of the automation of jobs, their answer is STEM. I mean, if those who don't know, this is science, tech, engineering, math. Do more of that. There's a place for it. That is to say, there are a lot of jobs still available for coders and so on and so forth. And I'm all for people getting these jobs. But if you're looking ahead, if you look at that list from the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute, you go down those 701 jobs one at a time, what you find in the top 20 or 30 are a whole lot of sort of low-level type tech jobs, medical technicians, library technicians, optical technicians. All these, the sort of jobs that people go to community colleges or maybe, four-year schools, and these people are not going to be Albert Einstein, but they're good, they understand, they do computer science, they understand, do this stuff, and they can get jobs as coders and so on. But these jobs will go early on. We don't know which jobs will finally survive, and we don't need to know that. But we need to not be naive in thinking that trying to keep ahead of the robots who've got Moore's law behind them is going to enable us to come up with tech jobs for people at a medium and low level. So that's one thing. And I really think that we should be saying loud and clear to all these people out in there in the education, the policy area who are using this word STEM. I think every time someone uses the word STEM, unless they're being critical of it, like I am, I think somebody should be saying boo and asking for a rationalization. What exactly is this going to achieve? Second thing, of course, is it is incredibly difficult to turn around an education system. I mean, oh my goodness, here in the US, with a lot of enormously well-intentioned efforts and an awful lot of money for a long time, we've been trying to get standards up and do all, and it's very, very hard to do. So even if there were a magic formula, the notion of turning around public education in less than a generation, I mean, this is a rather preposterous task. However, I do think one can seed alternative approaches, and one of which is the question of creativity, the capacity for self-invention. I mean, there are principles here that don't require you to reinvent the whole system. And secondly, recognizing that at the heart of certainly the higher levels of education, in secondary, post-secondary, that the humanities, the liberal arts, the creative disciplines, and also business disciplines. I'm not want to exclude that at all, because these all interrelate, actually need to be driving things, even if also it's great if we all have basic tech skills. But I'm not very hopeful about this, partly because of the ease with which lazy policymakers who do not want to think, let alone have to challenge the settled opinions out there in our sort of ruling classes, do not want to challenge this notion that, well, let's teach more tech.
So I'd like to ask you about technology and community. So many of our new technologies have promised to connect us and leave us more interconnected than ever. But just looking at many of the studies, it seems that the more time people spend with electronic technologies, the more lonely and disconnected they report being. And certainly our technologies have enabled us to entertain ourselves at home, to shop at home, to become more and more isolated. And in fact, time use studies show that the more time people spend using electronic technologies, the more isolated they are, in contrast to the more time spent reading, which is positively correlated with friendship building, with community building, and with interaction. So assuming that human flourishing requires friendship and community, what guidelines would you suggest to help us ensure that our new technologies actually assist in community building rather than in destroying it?
I do think it's an extraordinary thing, because quite genuinely, I mean, those who initially promoted Facebook and these other social media technologies saw them very much as ways to connect people and give them a greater sense of community. And I think we should not discard the major positive elements which are there. And I'm sure all of us use some of these technologies, and we communicate with parents and grandparents and grandchildren and friends around the world and so on, and have our lives are much less geographically bounded because of what has happened over the last generation. And as we critique the use of the abuse of these technologies, we need to recognize this. This is enormously important. One example is language, and it's progressively getting better and better and better. And of course, in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Babelfish. And of course it's very funny because most people think that was originated, and it really comes from the Bible because the Tower of Babel is from the Bible. But Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy picks up this notion of the Babelfish, which you put in your ear and you can hear in people in any language. Now we're pretty close to being there, and this is an absolutely extraordinary thing. So you can have pen pals in Mongolia and Hungary and all sorts of places with impossible languages, Finland. Find the most difficult language and you can do it. And we're on the cusp of being able to have this sort of, and these are extraordinary achievements in terms of building a global community, breaking down barriers and so on. So, this all needs to be said. Now, it is also the case that for many people, plainly enough to be captured by studies, they can get locked in. We mentioned Sherry Turkle from MIT and her very important work here. A number of books, one of which is called Together and Alone, which is focused precisely on teens and so on, getting locked away, talking to all these people, basically being isolated. I think there are ways of breaking out of that. And Tiff Schlein has come up with a notion of what she calls the tech Shabbat. And they're non-religious Jews, so that's obviously the language she would use. But 24 hours, once a week, she and her husband and their 2 kids turn absolutely everything off. And she's writing a book about it. And I think it's wonderful. I've written about her work. I think this is a wonderful idea. You're not saying anything is bad. You're just saying for 24 hours, we'll go without it. But like taking a month of alcohol or whatever it is. You're saying, I can do without this. And it gives you perspective. I think the little rules of thumb like that. I think the notion you ban devices from your home. There are things it's almost impossible to do in social family circumstances. But if we could all start, or maybe have a week off. A week of everything off once a year. You distance. And I think part of the way we will deal with the increasing robotization of our social lives, in which we're engaging in speech with robot-looking, human-looking, servants, slaves, delivery machines, all kinds of advisors, teachers, is by being able to cut out of it as just one tool. And so I look for simple tools like that rather than too much theorization.
You touch upon this in your book as well, and that's how do we know that this time it's different, right? In other words, we have a fair amount of data already about human adaptability to technological change, and it seems like the answer always comes out, well, we get used to it. So this time, we're arguing it's different. It's not like it has been before. And then secondly, how confident are we that we know exactly how these new technologies will shake out. And I'll just give one example. We've had, for instance, the ATMs, automated teller machines, with us since the early 80s, late 70s, more or less, in one fashion or another. And initially the prediction was that this is going to make all bank tellers disappear. And initially the predictions were right. But then what happened is banks discovered that, well, it's a lot easier to open a branch now, it's cheaper, and banks started opening more branches, employing more tellers. So in fact, at the end of that, we now have more bank tellers than we used to prior to the ATM. So how do we know that the same dynamic will not take hold in new technology?
I'll respond to your second point first, and I'm not trying to be cruel here, but that is the one example people give. And now...
I found it.
Now,
I Googled it.
Now it's going in reverse. The banks are now closing these little branches, you know, quite systematically. They mushroomed everywhere, you know. But yes, I mean, this is the point. No one is saying that sort of ex opere operator, you have a robot, jobs get lost. But to go to your first point, is it different this time? Actually, I was on a panel at an economist conference in Madrid. It was a lovely time at the Ritz-Carlton in Madrid, you know. Economists invite you to go somewhere, you go along, sit on a panel, and pontificate. And the conference was, is the digital revolution really different? And it was fascinating getting together all these experts and hearing all their take. And I think there was a nuanced response, that it was, well, yes, but. And I think the answer is yes, but. But, a couple of substantive points. You know, the word Luddite is widely used, you know. No one ever says, I'm a Luddite, you know. It's always, you're a Luddite. It's like saying, you're a fundamentalist, you know, or something, you know. You're a commie, you know. It's a term, it's a sort of somewhat abusive categorization. And it really it scares people into not criticizing technology. It really does. I think this is very important. If the word Luddite hadn't been around, I think policymakers, union leaders would be much more open to having these conversations because they want to get the sticker on them, you know. They were absolutely right. And research gets stronger and stronger proving. Now, David Ricardo, who was the most distinguished British economist after Adam Smith, David Ricardo was alive at the time, and he agreed with the Luddites. But he said, there's no point in not doing this because it'll be done overseas. And the evidence is coming in now. It's very striking. Andy Haldane, who is the chief economist for the Bank of England, did a study and has said that the number of British workers, of unskilled British workers, doubled after the 1810s, 20s, and all these machines coming in. Doubled to 40% from 20%. Because they had to compete with children. The machines were designed to be operated by children. Child labor hugely increased. It wasn't just machines. I had to compete with children. And of course, wages had collapsed because they could get children to do these things and people without skills. And these skilled weavers and so on had to go and compete with landless laborers. And that there wasn't a net benefit to the working people for 2 generations. So let's not say last time it was okay, and this time it could just be okay like last time. I think we've got to unpick the way a lot of these arguments are being used. Is it really different? Well, I think it's different. I mean, come on, I have this thing here, you know, which I pay, I don't know, $30 a month for or something, plus, of course, all the fees for data and so on. And it enables me to do all the incredible things that we can all do with these things. Yeah, this time it is going to be different. But on previous occasions, let's not be naive about the cost. Now, one final comment on that. It seems to me there's a non-trivial chance full employment is over. There's a very strong chance that we're going to have major disruption in labor markets. Very strong chance. Not just like, you know, when US Steel went down in Gary, Indiana, which was prosperous city in the country just about, maybe actually been the most prosperous, and is now, you know, was homicide capital of the USA a few years ago. Not just these regional industrial collapses, but you usually see a collapse of trucking. 3.5, the top job for Americans by number, American men, is truck drivers, 3.5 million of them. I think there will be 0 in 10 years' time. 0. And that's a reasonable prediction, which is very defensible. People won't all agree with it, but I think it's pretty strong. Cab drivers, the Uber stuff, Uber's designed their systems for machine driving. The human drivers are just a temporary, you know, but they get 80% of the money. You remove the human driver. Fares go down, Uber gets the money. If that happens, we end up with a huge drop in the desire for personal vehicle ownership. 95 to 97% of the time, your personal vehicle is unused. If that collapses, because Uber-type automated vehicles have maybe 95% uptime, Detroit, and it's what really left of it, collapses. You know, the auto industry is the industrial center of all the industrial economies. If the sales of autos drop by 80% in 20 years, which is entirely plausible, I mean, you look at these knock-on effects. This is different.
So we're going to turn now from that depressing prognostication to what's always one of the most interesting and lively parts of an evening conversation, which is hearing from you all. So,
hi, I'm Carl Savoy. Could you comment on the AI cloud and the coming singularity?
Would no be an adequate response to that? Yeah, well, the singularity, the idea is, you know, some of you know the name of Ray Kurzweil, who's an extraordinarily brilliant inventor, a little eccentric, works for Google now. Well, kind of. I mean, he has this, for a long time, has pushed this notion that the curve is going to become pretty much vertical. And he picked up the use of this term. Singularity can mean various things. This particular use of it from a sci-fi writer who wrote a short story about this back in the 70s. And the point is, once it becomes almost vertical, all bets are off. The event horizon, you know, you can't predict what will happen next because this super intelligence just takes over. And he debated one time, he debated a very distinguished biologist who was written sort of big textbooks on biology. And Kurzweil was saying, you know, every year, Moore's law, we replicate the brain more and more. Biologists said every year we know less about how the brain works. We discover we know less about how the brain works. So in fact, your curve makes no sense at all. Kurzweil said, you don't understand computing. And next, you know, I mean, that was the nature of the debate. He has given various dates. It's a bit like, you know, some religious cultists saying this is the date the world's going to end. And they kind of put it off because they get close, you know, and he's done this with his predictions. So, I mean, I think Kurzweil's interesting, but I don't take him too seriously.
With the presence of children in impoverished communities and underperforming schools, children in environments where they don't have even a computer in the home or high-speed internet access, what can we possibly do to prepare them for this coming age of change?
A couple comments. I mean, one is that, this isn't something I followed in detail, but the studies are all over the place on the value of computers to children in education. You know, there have been a lot of schools, you know, every child has to have a laptop or a tablet and so on. Some studies have certainly shown that they performed less well with all this equipment. So I think we need not to fetishize access to these machines. I think the educational task in impoverished areas should be framed in other terms than lack of access to these machines. Even if, obviously, for certain students, access to it is very important. And of course, I mean, public library provision is there at a level, and there are other ways in which there can be, particularly for the more academically motivated students. But I think we need not to fetishize this notion of you've got to have this thing, partly because all this evidence is there that kids are going to hang out on this, they're going to, you know, it's going to be bad news for them, they're going to lose their social skills and so on. So, I mean, I don't want to trivialize this at all, but it does seem to me that that's part of it. Of course, another part of it is that, basic mobile phone access is relatively cheap. It is very cheap in some other parts of the world. And I mean, in Africa, I was just thinking, is this like 2/3 of Africans now have mobile access? Something like that. And you can get an actual smartphone now in a developing world environment for $30, $40, $50, something like that. Incredible availability of resources in very disadvantaged communities. I mean, more Africans now have mobile phones than have electricity. I mean, so quite extraordinary leapfrogging here, using these very, very flexible and digital technologies. I think probably we should be being more creative in the way in which we make these technologies available within in poor areas within the industrial economies. And of course, the US pretty much has the biggest sort of bimodal, you know, distribution of Brazil always used to be the country with the biggest bimodal income distribution. But the US is certainly up there with enormous levels of poverty, and rural poverty, quite apart from urban poverty. And maybe we should be more creative in the way in which we think about providing access to kids in that environment. I mean, maybe providing them all with flip phones, you know, which gives you basic internet access, and are very cheap now. And providing them with subsidized or free data access and things of that kind, rather than saying the schools are all going to have all this equipment. But I think the educational challenges are not primarily technological ones for people in these impoverished areas.
Thank you. This evening's been wonderful. I appreciate it. I'd like to offer a little frame to the conversation and ask, what are your thoughts on the plausibility of the nature of human organizations evolving and how that's going to have repercussions on governments, on economic systems, on the fundamental operating system of the current world as we know it?
You're going to have to give one little phrase of explanation of what you said at the beginning, the human organizations evolving.
Well, the most concrete thing I can point to is the distributed ledger technology space.
Okay.
Blockchain technology, which is just one example, and the way that we're in the process of birthing very fluid organizations, the likes of which never could have existed before, and how that's going to totally be able to compete with organizations of antiquity, such as possibly even nation-state governments.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very important question. I mean, I think blockchain, of course, has been hyped for a long time. Without prejudice to its proper uses. But I think that it's a case study in hype, and of course, given the power generation issues, I mean, there's some real fundamental problems there. But I would certainly agree that these technologies are providing the opportunity for fresh kinds of organization. And I mean, for example, this translation thing, I mean, it seems to me if we begin having the emergence of what I call global publics, in which you have cat lovers, let's just say if all the cat lovers in the world got together, you know, there are probably 1 billion people in the world who are fixated with cats, you know? And if they were all able to communicate with each other and organize themselves, and this translation technology is very close to making that kind of thing entirely possible. I think the new global dynamics will emerge. And it's a trivial example, but it's an example of something which is really quite significant. I mean, you could see, for example, push of basic income and things of this kind, global publics operating, and national governments having less and less capacity. I think national governments are generally going to go down, slipping down. International organizations have been getting a bad rap recently, the EU particularly, and of course, the US doesn't like the UN and so on. But cities are becoming much more important. This has been a big development over the last 30, 40 years. National governments hate the fact that things like UN agencies deal with cities directly, and there are a lot of things happening there which are based on traditional technologies. So it seems to me a rebalancing of potential for people power. I think a lot of very exciting things could happen as well as dangerous things. Final comment, of course, is the issue of resilience. And there's something resilient about a traditional human community, and something which is hackable and can evaporate tomorrow morning. I mean, I think that there are fundamental questions of resilience here, which are not being sufficiently addressed, both by governments, by regulatory bodies, by corporations. It's just too easy for things to disappear, too easy for them to be hacked, and the need for new systems, of new organizational structures and so on, to have the kind of resilience which traditional ones have. And I think this human thing, whatever else we are about, you know, the campfire, you know, the caveman and so on, round the campfire, the pioneers, family around. I mean, I think there's something here in the human community which we will not want to get rid of as these new powers and opportunities flourish.
Could you put yourselves back in time and give your speech tonight before we learned to speak, and before there was a printing press, and before there was alternating current, and before there was rapid transit through the air, and so on? All of these could have been predicted to do exactly what you're predicting now. Speak from one of those points of view, historically. I mean, as though you were there watching the jobs disappear with this new technology?
Well, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, and around 1800 and soon after, in England, which was the fount of the global industrializing economy. If one had been there then, one would have been, well, fear and flourishing. This is the sort of dialogue, which we catch it ourselves in tonight. Flourishing, yes. These new technologies are going to build the world's first industrial economy. And they're going to make life a lot easier for an awful lot of people, for forever to come. These technologies are going to achieve all these things, as we now know, because I had my crystal ball, I could see the trajectory. On the other hand, as Ricardo said, these guys are right, that these developments are going to destroy the skilled labor force, which we now have. And as the research more recently has shown, it halved the skilled labor force in England. Now, I would have said at the time, isn't it a good thing that these people don't have the vote? Because they can riot, but they cannot actually shape public policy. Because at that point, of course, Britain was a very limited democracy. And I would say, if this thing were to happen in 200 years' time, when we have universal franchise, governments had better watch out. Because the situation we now have, and of course we see this in our current political situation, the disenfranchised, flyover states, and so on and so forth, in various parts of the world, we see disenfranchised people who have been deeply hurt by industrial change, already by industrial change, and we see them going to the ballot box and influencing governments in response. Now, the Luddites, they put them down by sending in the army and hanging them. I think looking forward from 200 years ago to now, I'd be saying we need to be much more concerned about the social and political impact of industrial change if we are going to benefit from it, and if human flourishing is at the center of our concerns.
Nigel, thank you.